Today, we can't even fill our numbers when it comes to any service branch in this country. Brave men like this are saying, hold on a second. I don't mind joining the military. In fact, it would be a proud thing to do. My father did, my grandfather did. But I'm not going to go in a place where I'm told to sit down in a class and be filled with a bunch of lies, racist, contemptible lies. That I'm not going to volunteer for. That's why we're not meeting our numbers. All right, today, June 22nd, 1945, that would be 70 years ago, the Marines landed on Okinawa. The plan was to take Okinawa, which is a big island off Japan, it's Japanese property, and to then invade Japan. The casualties in Okinawa, the U.S. casualties, were so severe. That's when Truman decided, we can't invade Japan. And he went to Oppenheimer and the others, the Manhattan Project, and he said, are we ready? As vice president, he wasn't vice president long under FDR, because FDR died. Truman, not till became president, was aware of the Manhattan Project. They kept it from him. Back then, he was sort of the Kamala Harris of his day. But they actually kept it from him. And so he learned about it, and they weren't sure these bombs would work. In fact, the two bombs they used were totally different, different types of bombs. It's not like they could test them all the time. They had done some tests, but they weren't sure. And it's not the kind of bomb you just open the fuselage, the bottom of the plane, and they start dropping it. You literally have to roll these things out. And they have to build tracks in the plane to roll them out. So this was all brand new stuff. But Truman wanted to end this war. And Truman said, I'm not going to take some kind of halfway peace deal or anything, or halfway surrender. It must be a surrender without conditions. We must destroy the Japanese Empire, which is exactly what we did. Anyway, so let's take a look at this. Again, the 78th anniversary of Okinawa, and I guarantee you most children have not learned about this. What I just told you, many of you know, most children in America have no idea. Go.
It's Easter Sunday. The military calls it L-Day. Many think it might be their last day on Earth. The morning light reveals a stunning sight. The largest amphibious assault ever mounted in World War II's Pacific Theater. 1,500 ships, 500,000 men. Many had never even heard of Okinawa. They had heard of Normandy, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, where the enemy had mowed down Americans by the thousands as they came ashore. Their briefing was matter-of-fact and frightening. Expect dug-in defenses on the hills above the beaches. Expect a storm of repelling firepower. Expect an 80%...
Let's stop for a moment. And I'm sorry, but this is in my mind. You look at these men. Look at these men. They're going to storm Okinawa. Many of them are going to die. In fact, in the first wave, most of them are going to die. These are young men. They've really not had an opportunity to live. And given what people say about this country, given what they say about men, let me ask you a question. And I mean what I'm about to say. Does this look like white privilege to you? Does it? This is why these racists in our country today are so disgusting. They're even more disgusting than the racists of old. They blow all this off. They blow off the Civil War. They blow off all these battles. They racialize everything. And so I have to engage. I can't just ignore it. The overwhelming majority of men, first of all, the overwhelming majority of people who fought in World War II on our side were men. The overwhelming majority were straight men who hadn't transitioned, who weren't thinking about transitioning. I have to say it. The overwhelming number of these men were not privileged in any way. They came from very typical American backgrounds. And they weren't from a dominant culture. They weren't prejudiced or racist against anybody. Their country called them to duty, and they didn't look back. These battles in the Pacific were horrendous. I had relatives who fought in the Pacific. When they talk about Saipan, they're talking about the Battle of Guadalcanal, among other things. The Solomon Islands. When they talk about these battles in the Pacific, they're talking about Iwo Jima, which was horrific. They're talking about Midway, the Battle of the Philippines. And it goes on and on and on, the number of people who died and put their lives on the line, and families suffered. And today, it's all about racism and race, and the imperialist Americans and the colonialist Americans, and on and on and on. That's why we do this. This is important. These days should be celebrated and remembered in every school district in America, but they're ignored. Instead, they're learning critical race theory. Surgical mutilation, they call transitioning. Gender identification. Phrases we've never heard of before. Phrases these men who fought and died 78 years ago would be repulsed by. Today, we can't even fill our numbers when it comes to any service branch in this country. Brave men like this are saying, hold on a second. I don't mind joining the military. In fact, it would be a proud thing to do. My father did, my grandfather did. But I'm not going to go in a place where I'm told to sit down in a class and be filled with a bunch of lies, racist, contemptible lies. That I'm not going to volunteer for. That's why we're not meeting our numbers. So on an anniversary like this, it's very important to remember who these men are, and it's very important to remember what's happened to this country since. Go.
Great. Americans have limited intelligence going in. Aerial reconnaissance is lacking. Maps are inaccurate. They can only guess at what lies ahead. The Japanese consider Okinawa home turf. They are preparing to defend it with more than 100,000 men and a fanatical devotion to their cause. They won't let the Americans in without a fight. On April 1st, the invasion starts. But instead of enemy fire, they meet an eerie silence. They move cautiously, expecting a trap. But there's no sign of the enemy. Word gets back to the fleet. There is no one to fight. Subsequent waves of troops come ashore. They calmly grab their gear and walk upright onto the beach. Within hours, thousands of men unload a city's worth of infrastructure onto the beaches of Okinawa. Many keep their guns stowed and never have to dig a foxhole. Instead of the Japanese army, Americans find only civilians. Okinawans are an isolated people. Mainland Japanese consider them inferior, little more than rustic peasants. But they have stories to tell. Stories of terrifying propaganda commanding them to avoid capture at all costs. Stories of Okinawan boys taken and forced into military service. Stories that reveal the Japanese army is out there. Somewhere. By the third day of the invasion of Okinawa, there is still no sign of the enemy. Commanding General Simon Buckner sends a message to the Marines.
All restrictions removed on your advance northward.
Men and materiel move up the island and into the Motobu Peninsula, a mountainous no man's land. They approach a high, craggy mass called Mount Yetake. Suddenly, fire comes from everywhere. Americans are pinned down by mortars and machine guns no matter where they go. Companies get split up running for cover. They barely know where to return fire. After days of easy and rapid advance, casualties pile up by the...
They're surrounded. The Japanese are dug into the mountains. They're dug into these foxholes, and they're surrounded. Go ahead.
That was an old artillery training ground, Okinawa, and they knew every foot of the island. They could drop a shell any place they saw us.
After almost a week of uphill fighting, there is little to show for it, except for blood and bandages. The Japanese have the advantage. In the midst of this nightmare, news reaches the front lines. On Mount Yetake, officers rally the troops with a new strategy. Attack from two directions, pinch them into a high, tight spot, then use air and artillery strikes to pummel the 1,200-foot mountaintop. It's an uphill slog against what one officer calls a phantom enemy. For 4 more days, they slowly move up the mountain under withering fire.
Stop a sec. You see how courageous these men are? Courageous they are. They don't know where these bullets are coming from, and they are moving up that mountain. And many of them know it's going to be their last movement, if not immediately, the next day or what have you. They certainly have no idea whether they're going to live or not. Go ahead.
Then, Marines finally take the top of Mount Yetake and take a look around. 2,000 Japanese bodies litter the peaks, trenches, and tunnels. Almost to a man, they had fought to the death. This one mountaintop cost the Marines almost 1,000 men. It was their first test against the Japanese defenses on Okinawa, and they wonder if they've only scratched the surface. April 6th dawns quiet in the waters off Okinawa. The calm did not comfort Ensign Doug Aitken.
We knew that we were going to be in for trouble. We just knew it.
On the nearby islands, the Japanese had been gathering every usable plane and pilot remaining in their arsenal. Some are inexperienced, but no less devoted.
Why? Kamikazes. Keep something in mind. The Emperor of Japan was viewed as a god. And Tojo, of course, was a dictator. But together, Tojo was able to militarize this notion of a godlike figure in the emperor. So many of these people believed that they were fighting basically for God. And so that's why they would fight right to the end. That's why they would commit these kamikaze or suicide missions. That's why they wouldn't give up. And the other thing Americans faced were civilians who, even young children, who were armed to the teeth or who were booby-trapped. Go ahead.
Call this mission Kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum. They take off in waves. They begin a kamikaze spree that dwarfs anything before or since. In the next 2 days, over 350 enemy planes wreak absolute havoc. American pilots try to stop them in roller coaster dogfights. Navy gunners try to derail them in white-knuckle high-speed combat. sometimes close enough to see each other's faces. General Buckner, an avid hunter, describes the adrenaline rush to his wife.
I have had thrills in duck blinds, but none comparable to that of seeing an enemy plane shot down when it was heading directly at our ship.
Some are cut down, but others get through. For sailors like Doug Aitken, the horror is burned into memory.
And all of a sudden, general quarters, all hands man your battle stations.
See, they can't stop them all. And it's not like they had Patriot missile systems. So you put as much flak in the air as you possibly can and hope something hits, but it's very, very difficult. Same when you're another fighter jet trying to take these guys out. They're not about fighting plane to plane. They're about fighting plane to plane for the purpose of getting through and then doing a dive bomb against one of the ships. And you can see one plane, virtually one plane can take out an entire destroyer or aircraft carrier. Go ahead.
First of all, power went out. So we opened the doors and we could see all this commotion and all this smoke.
Japan intentionally crashes 1,900 planes in suicide dives around Okinawa, the most intense kamikaze attacks of the entire Pacific campaign. They sink 26 ships and damage 164 more. The Japanese consider it noble sacrifice. The Americans consider it inhumane warfare.
You can't identify people. The right thing to do is bury at sea.
It is the greatest concentration of Navy losses since Pearl Harbor.
And you can't identify people because they're burned to a crisp. That's why. So ended a hell of a way to die. Now you know a little bit more about Okinawa and why Harry Truman decided that we could not possibly invade Japan. The estimates came in. I think I read that Truman was told that we could lose up to 1 million men. And he said, no, we can't do that. And then he went and looked at these atomic bombs or the information about them. And to show you how fanatic they were, after the first bomb was dropped, the Japanese still wouldn't surrender. One bomb took out 60 to 70,000 people. The second bomb took out 80 to 90,000 people. There were no other bombs left, but the Japanese didn't know that. So then the emperor, and they insist that the emperor sign the surrender. Then the emperor finally surrendered. So it began on April 1st and ended on June 22nd, 1945, the Battle of Okinawa. 2.5 months. So there, now you have it.
Want to see more? Sign up for Levin TV.